The war that destroyed ancient Greece. In the decades following the Persian invasions, the Greek world stood at a rare moment of unity. Cities that had once quarreled had fought side by side against a foreign empire and survived. Yet shared victory did not produce lasting harmony. Instead, it created a new and more complicated question: who would lead the Greek world now that the external threat had receded? Athens emerged from the wars transformed. Its fleet had proven decisive at sea, and its walls, rebuilt despite Spartan objections, signaled renewed confidence. Through the Delian League, Athens organized a maritime alliance originally intended to deter future Persian aggression. Member states contributed ships or tribute, and at first the arrangement appeared cooperative. Gradually, however, tribute replaced ships, and what began as an alliance evolved into a naval empire. Athenian power rested on mobility, revenue, and control of sea lanes that connected grain routes, trade networks, and distant garrisons. Sparta, by contrast, did not seek maritime dominance. Its authority rested on land power and a rigid social system designed for military cohesion. Spartan leadership within the Peloponnesian League relied less on tribute and more on long-standing alliances bound by mutual defense. Stability, not expansion, defined Spartan priorities. The Spartan state had little interest in distant campaigns so long as its security on the Peloponnese remained intact. Its strength lay in disciplined hoplite formations and a reputation for endurance that discouraged rebellion. This divergence produced a structural imbalance. Athens depended on continuous revenue from allied states to maintain its fleet and urban population. Its strategy required outward engagement. Sparta relied on agricultural foundations and conservative governance. Its strategy favored containment and preservation. One power projected influence across the Aegean, the other maintained dominance through proximity and restraint. As long as each remained within its sphere, coexistence was possible. But the spheres were not clearly defined. Tensions deepened as Athens intervened in disputes among smaller states. Revolts within the Delian League were suppressed, often forcefully, reinforcing the perception that Athens governed an empire rather than a voluntary coalition. Tribute assessments increased, and Athenian clericies, settlements of Athenian citizens abroad, extended influence further. From Sparta's perspective, Athenian growth altered the balance of power in ways that could not be ignored. Fear, more than hostility, shaped Spartan deliberations. Alliances hardened these suspicions into strategic calculations. Corinth, a major naval power within the Peloponnesian League, clashed with Athens over influence in western Greece. Disputes involving Corcyra and Potidaea drew both great powers closer to confrontation. Each localized crisis tested the limits of restraint. Diplomatic congresses attempted to contain escalation, yet underlying mistrust persisted. The question was no longer whether Athens sought expansion, but how far that expansion might extend. By the late 430s BC, the Greek world was divided into two interconnected systems of obligation. Athens commanded a maritime network sustained by tribute and fortified by walls that linked city to port. Sparta led a land-based coalition wary of Athenian encroachment. Neither side initially desired total war. Yet neither could accept strategic inferiority. As minor disputes accumulated, the balance between sea power and land power grew increasingly fragile. When fear becomes policy and alliances demand action, restraint becomes difficult to maintain. The Archidamian War, strategy without resolution. In 431 BC, diplomacy gave way to mobilization. Spartan forces crossed into Attica, beginning what would later be called the Archidamian War. Yet from the outset, this was not a contest designed for swift decision. It was a collision between two incompatible strategies, one built on endurance behind walls, the other on devastation through invasion. Sparta's approach was direct and traditional. Each campaigning season, Peloponnesian armies marched north and ravaged Athenian farmland. The objective was not territorial conquest but economic and psychological pressure. By burning crops and dismantling rural infrastructure, Sparta hoped to force Athens into open battle, where Spartan hoplites possessed a clear advantage. The calculation was simple: provoke decisive engagement and break Athenian confidence. Athens, under the leadership of Pericles, rejected that logic. Instead of defending the countryside, the population withdrew behind the long walls connecting Athens to its port at Piraeus. Supplies continued to arrive by sea, sustained by tribute from allied states and maritime trade. The Athenian fleet conducted raids along the Peloponnesian coast, striking exposed settlements while avoiding full-scale land confrontation. The strategy prioritized preservation of manpower and reliance on naval superiority. Endurance, not immediate retaliation, would determine success. This contrast defined the war's early years. Spartan armies devastated empty fields but failed to compel battle. Athenian fleets harassed coastlines but could not inflict decisive harm inland. Each side struck where it was strongest and avoided its opponent's primary advantage. As a result, annual campaigns produced destruction but not resolution. The conflict settled into a rhythm of seasonal invasion and maritime reprisal. The balance shifted abruptly when plague struck Athens in 430 BC. Crowded conditions within the city walls accelerated the disease's spread, undermining morale and reducing manpower. The death of Pericles further destabilized political leadership. For Sparta, the epidemic appeared to validate its pressure strategy. Yet even this catastrophe did not produce surrender. Athenian institutions adapted, commanders rotated, and the fleet continued operating. Strategic endurance persisted despite internal strain. Sparta, meanwhile, confronted its own limitations. Sustained annual invasions strained Peloponnesian allies and exposed the constraints of a coalition army not designed for prolonged occupation. Without a navy capable of challenging Athenian supply lines, Spartan offensives remained incomplete. The inability to blockade Piraeus meant Athens retained access to grain imports from the Black Sea, preserving urban survival. What Sparta could destroy on land, Athens could offset through maritime networks. As the war progressed, localized theaters expanded the struggle. Campaigns in western Greece and northern Aegean waters introduced new fronts. The revolt of Mytilene and Athenian response demonstrated the fragility of imperial cohesion. Decisions made in the assembly carried strategic consequences far beyond Attica. Each rebellion required forceful suppression to deter further defection, yet each suppression deepened resentment within the empire. Athens remained strong, but cohesion demanded constant reinforcement. By the early 420s BC, exhaustion weighed on both coalitions. Neither side had achieved decisive superiority. Spartan invasions continued without strategic breakthrough. Athenian naval dominance persisted without forcing Peloponnesian capitulation. Attrition defined the landscape. War had become a test of structural resilience rather than battlefield supremacy. In 421 BC, the Peace of Nicias sought to formalize a return to stability. Territories were to be restored, prisoners exchanged, and hostilities suspended. Yet the agreement masked unresolved tensions. Key allies resisted compliance, and mutual suspicion endured. The fundamental contrast, naval empire versus land coalition, remained unchanged. Peace, in this context, represented intermission rather than conclusion. The Archidamian War revealed the limitations of both strategies. Sparta could devastate but not compel, Athens could endure but not conclude. The conflict had settled into stalemate, yet ambition and insecurity had not disappeared. Beneath the appearance of settlement, structural rivalry persisted, waiting for an opportunity to escalate beyond attrition. The Sicilian expedition, imperial overreach. In 415 BC, Athens stood at a crossroads. Years of war had produced no decisive outcome, yet the city still commanded the largest navy in Greece and controlled a far-reaching empire. Instead of consolidating its position, Athens chose expansion. The proposed expedition to Sicily promised wealth, strategic advantage, and the possibility of breaking the stalemate by striking beyond the Greek mainland. Sicily was not peripheral. Its cities were prosperous, its grain resources substantial, and its location strategically valuable. Supporters of the campaign argued that success there would secure supply lines, deny resources to enemies, and project Athenian power into the western Mediterranean. Opposition existed, but confidence prevailed. The assembly authorized the largest overseas force ever dispatched by a Greek city-state, committing ships, soldiers, and resources on an unprecedented scale. This decision reflected deeper patterns within Athenian strategy. Empire had been built through maritime initiative, and success reinforced belief in expansion as solution. Risk appeared manageable because previous campaigns had succeeded. What changed in Sicily was scale. Distance magnified every error, and the absence of immediate pressure at home reduced caution in planning. From the beginning, the expedition revealed deep flaws in decision-making. Command was divided, objectives were unclear, and intelligence was optimistic rather than accurate. Strategic assumptions replaced careful assessment. The removal of Alcibiades, one of the expedition's principal advocates, destabilized leadership before operations even began. Remaining commanders faced a complex theater without unified direction or clearly defined priorities. Initial operations achieved little. Syracuse proved stronger than anticipated, capable of rapid mobilization and effective defense. Athenian forces hesitated, allowing the defenders time to adapt. Siege work stalled, and early naval engagements failed to secure control of the harbor. What had been envisioned as a swift demonstration of superiority became a prolonged struggle far from home. Logistics soon emerged as the decisive constraint. Reinforcing and supplying a massive force across such distance strained Athenian resources. Every delay increased costs and reduced flexibility. Communication with Athens was slow, limiting strategic adjustment. Meanwhile, Syracuse received external assistance, transforming a local defense into a wider coalition effort. The longer the campaign continued, the more it favored the defenders. Internal pressures compounded external resistance. Commanders disagreed over strategy, morale declined, and seasonal campaigning cycles restricted operational momentum. Athens faced the classic dilemma of expeditionary warfare: retreat would signal weakness, yet escalation risked total commitment. Political expectations at home discouraged withdrawal, even as conditions deteriorated and casualties mounted. Strategic choices became reactive rather than deliberate. As months passed, the expedition ceased to be a tool of policy and became a struggle for survival. Resources intended for decisive victory were consumed simply to maintain position. Naval losses reduced operational freedom, and the initiative shifted irreversibly. The campaign exposed how quickly power projection could transform into vulnerability when strategic assumptions failed. By the time Athens attempted withdrawal, the balance had already turned. Enemy coordination improved, local knowledge favored defenders, and accumulated losses limited options. What remained was not strategy but damage control, executed too late to alter the outcome. The final phase unfolded rapidly. Athenian fleets were defeated in the harbor, retreat routes were blocked, and surviving forces were driven inland. Cut off and surrounded, the army surrendered. Thousands were killed or enslaved. Almost no one returned. The expedition ended not merely in defeat, but in annihilation. The consequences were immediate and severe. Athens lost ships, experienced commanders, and irreplaceable manpower. Financial reserves were depleted, and naval superiority was compromised. The psychological impact was equally damaging. Allies questioned Athenian invincibility, while enemies recognized vulnerability and opportunity. The Sicilian expedition marked the war's true turning point. It was not simply a failed campaign, but a structural rupture. Athens had gambled its surplus strength on expansion and lost the capacity to sustain prolonged conflict. From this moment forward, survival replaced ambition. The war would continue, but under entirely different conditions. Persian gold and Spartan adaptation. After the catastrophe in Sicily, the balance of power in the Greek world shifted rapidly. Athens had lost ships, experienced crews, and thousands of soldiers, yet the war did not end. Instead, the disaster exposed vulnerabilities that enemies and allies alike could now see. Confidence in Athenian invincibility collapsed, and revolt spread across the empire. For Sparta, the moment offered opportunity, but only if it could solve a long-standing weakness. To defeat Athens permanently, Sparta needed something it had never fully possessed before: a navy capable of challenging Athenian control of the sea. Sparta's traditional strength lay in disciplined land armies, not maritime warfare. Earlier in the conflict, this limitation prevented decisive victory because Athens could always resupply through sea routes. Recognizing this reality, Spartan leadership shifted strategy. Rather than relying solely on seasonal invasions of Attica, Sparta began focusing on long-term structural competition. This meant building fleets, training rowers, and establishing permanent positions closer to Athenian territory. The war was no longer only about destroying farmland, it became about breaking the systems that allowed Athens to function as a naval empire. The decisive change came through external partnership. Persia, still interested in weakening Greek powers that might threaten its western territories, began funding Spartan naval construction. Persian gold allowed Sparta to pay rowers, build ships, and maintain fleets for extended periods. This transformed the strategic landscape. Athens had long depended on tribute from its allies to sustain maritime dominance. Now Sparta could compete financially as well as militarily. The conflict shifted from a purely Greek struggle into a wider geopolitical contest shaped by external resources and competing regional interests. At the same time, Sparta adapted operationally. Instead of brief seasonal campaigns, Spartan forces established a permanent fortified position at Decelia in Attica. This outpost disrupted Athenian agriculture, cut access to silver mines, and forced Athens to rely even more heavily on imported resources. Maintaining the city and fleet became increasingly expensive. Every ship lost became harder to replace. Every rebellion within the empire required resources Athens could no longer easily spare. Gradually, economic pressure began achieving what earlier invasions could not. Inside the Athenian Empire, loyalty weakened under pressure. Subject states saw opportunity to revolt, calculating that Athens might no longer guarantee protection. Each uprising forced Athens to divert ships and soldiers away from major strategic fronts. Suppressing rebellion became a constant necessity rather than an occasional operation. The empire that once funded Athenian dominance now demanded continuous military investment simply to remain intact. Structural strength slowly transformed into structural vulnerability as costs multiplied and reliable tribute declined. Spartan naval commanders learned quickly. Early defeats did not stop adaptation. Training improved, coordination increased, and alliances expanded. The emergence of capable leadership within the Spartan navy helped close the experience gap with Athens. Over time, Spartan fleets became capable of contesting sea control in critical regions. Instead of avoiding naval engagement, Sparta could now force confrontation on terms increasingly favorable to itself. The strategic initiative began shifting away from Athens, which now fought defensively rather than expansively. Athens attempted recovery through emergency measures. New ships were built, new crews trained, and remaining allies pressured to increase contributions. Short-term successes temporarily stabilized the situation. However, the deeper problem remained unchanged. Athens could still win battles, but it could no longer afford sustained strategic losses. Every campaign now carried higher risk because reserve manpower and financial resources had been permanently reduced by the Sicilian disaster. The margin for error narrowed dramatically. By the late stages of the war, the conflict had transformed into a test of endurance between a declining naval empire and an adapting coalition supported by external wealth. Athens still possessed experience, institutional knowledge, and defensive infrastructure. Sparta now possessed financial backing, naval capability, and growing strategic confidence. The question was no longer whether Sparta could challenge Athens at sea, but whether Athens could survive long enough to rebuild its former strength. As fleets maneuvered across the Aegean and alliances shifted under pressure, the war approached its decisive phase. Athens remained dangerous, but no longer dominant. Sparta remained determined, but no longer strategically limited. Both sides understood that one decisive loss at sea could determine the survival of an empire. The conflict, once defined by stalemate, now moved toward final confrontation where exhaustion and adaptation would decide the future of the Greek world. Collapse, surrender, and the end of the war. By the final phase of the conflict, the long struggle between Athens and Sparta had become less about single battles and more about survival. Decades of continuous warfare had exhausted manpower, drained treasuries, and destabilized alliances across the Greek world. The war that began as a contest for regional influence had evolved into a systemic conflict where economic endurance, political stability, and strategic adaptation mattered more than traditional battlefield victories. Athens still possessed defensive advantages. Its long walls protected the urban population, and its remaining fleet could still contest sea routes. However, the margin for recovery had nearly vanished. The empire that once provided steady tribute revenue now required constant military presence just to prevent revolt. Every campaign demanded resources Athens could barely afford. Meanwhile, Spartan leadership understood that total victory required eliminating Athens' last strategic advantage, control of maritime supply lines, especially grain shipments vital for feeding the population. The turning point emerged through Spartan naval leadership under Lysander. Unlike earlier Spartan commanders, he combined political skill, diplomatic flexibility, and strategic patience. He cultivated strong relationships with Persian authorities, particularly Cyrus the Younger, whose financial support allowed Spartan fleets to maintain long-term operational presence. This funding enabled consistent payment for rowers and ship crews, ensuring higher morale and reducing desertion rates. Over time, Spartan naval forces became not only viable but strategically dominant. The final decisive moment came near Aegospotami, a strategically critical location controlling access to Black Sea grain routes. Athenian fleets needed to maintain presence in this region to protect supply chains and maintain influence over allied territories. Spartan forces, under Lysander's command, exploited Athenian operational habits. Rather than seeking immediate engagement, Spartan fleets waited for the moment when Athenian crews were disorganized and dispersed. When the attack finally came, it was devastating. Most of the Athenian fleet was captured or destroyed with minimal Spartan losses. The defeat was not simply tactical, it was existential. Athens lost the naval force required to protect its grain supply and imperial communication lines. The psychological impact was equally severe. For decades, Athenian identity had been tied to naval superiority. Losing the fleet meant losing both military capability and political confidence. Control of the nearby Hellespont allowed Spartan forces to block grain shipments heading toward Athens. Starvation became a real threat. Without naval power, Athens could not escort merchant ships or challenge blockades. The city's defensive walls, once symbols of security, now trapped the population inside a slowly weakening economic system. Supplies dwindled, prices rose, and public morale deteriorated. Inside Athens, political unity collapsed under pressure. War exhaustion, fear of famine, and declining military options forced leaders to consider surrender. Unlike earlier phases of the war, there was no realistic path to rebuilding naval strength quickly enough to break Spartan control. Years of continuous losses had removed trained sailors and experienced commanders. Emergency shipbuilding could not replace lost institutional knowledge. Sparta, however, did not simply seek battlefield victory. Its strategic objective was to permanently remove Athens as an imperial competitor. When negotiations began, Spartan demands focused on dismantling the structures that had made Athenian dominance possible. Athens was forced to surrender its remaining fleet, tear down the long walls, and accept political restructuring under Spartan supervision. The surrender marked the formal end of the war, but it also symbolized a deeper transformation in the Greek world. Athens survived as a city, but not as an empire. Its democratic system was temporarily replaced under Spartan influence, reflecting the broader ideological and political consequences of the conflict. Meanwhile, Sparta achieved its long-standing objective of breaking Athenian power, though maintaining dominance across Greece would later prove more difficult than achieving victory. The end of the war did not create lasting stability. Instead, it demonstrated how prolonged systemic conflict could weaken even the most powerful states. Athens lost through cumulative exhaustion rather than a single catastrophic event. Sparta won through adaptation, external funding, and strategic patience rather than overwhelming early superiority. In retrospect, the final years of the war revealed a fundamental lesson about power in the ancient world. Military strength alone was not enough. Economic networks, alliances, morale, and institutional resilience ultimately determined survival. When Athens lost control of its naval system and supply networks, its political and military structures collapsed soon after. The war ended not because one side suddenly became strong, but because one side could no longer sustain the cost of continued resistance. The fall of Athens marked the conclusion of one of the most destructive conflicts in Greek history. It reshaped political alliances, weakened the major city-states, and created a power vacuum that would shape the next era of Greek and Mediterranean history.